High in the Andes, an ancient traveler once swore he heard the mountain speak his name, a whisper so clear, so human, it sent shivers down his spine. He wasn't alone. Across continents and centuries, people have stood beneath towering peaks, convinced the very rocks were speaking to them. In Greece, Mount Olympus echoed with the laughter of gods. In India, pilgrims bowed to the sacred murmurs of Mount Kailash. Native tribes in North America told of elders who could understand the warnings rumbling from the cliffs. These weren't just stories, they were lived experiences, woven into the fabric of cultures worldwide. But here's the haunting question. What if these whispers weren't divine messages or figments of imagination, but something far more tangible? What if the mountains were truly speaking, and we simply misheard them? Imagine standing on a wind-scarred ridge, miles from civilization, when suddenly the air around you hums with a sound almost like words. No wonder our ancestors believed mountains were alive. Without the tools of modern science, how could they explain the groans of shifting rock, the eerie melodies of wind through crevices, or the way their own voices sometimes echoed back to them, distorted, as if answering? These natural phenomena became the stuff of legend, blurring the line between earth and spirit. And yet, buried beneath the myths lies a fascinating truth. The mountains were communicating, just not in the way anyone expected. This is a journey into the gap between what was heard and what was real, a detective story spanning thousands of years, from the sacred slopes of myth to the cutting-edge science of today. We'll unravel how seismic tremors mimic the growls of angry deities, how wind carving through stone could be mistaken for whispers, and why our own brains are wired to hear voices where none exist. Along the way, we'll meet shamans who decoded mountain language, explorers lured by spectral calls, and modern researchers using hydrophones to eavesdrop on the earth itself. By the end, you'll never listen to a distant echo or a gust of wind the same way again. So lean in, because the mountains have been speaking all along. We just needed to learn how to listen. To the ancient Greeks, Mount Olympus wasn't just a mount, and it was a towering palace where Zeus and the gods held court, their voices carried on the thunder that rolled down its slopes. When the earth trembled or the wind howled through its passes, people below listened intently, convinced the deities were speaking. Half a world away, Hindu pilgrims still circle Mount Kailash, believing its silent peaks channel the hum of the universe itself, a sound so sacred it's said to purify the soul. And in the American Southwest, the Hopi people tell of the San Francisco peaks, where ancestral spirits whisper through the rustling pines. These weren't just geological features, they were living, breathing entities, their very presence woven into the spiritual fabric of entire civilizations. But what if these divine voices had a far simpler explanation? Picture a shepherd in ancient Thessaly, resting at the base of Olympus as dusk falls. A sudden crack echoes from the cliffs above, not the voice of Zeus, but the sound of rock splitting from temperature changes. Or imagine a monk meditating near Kailash, his chant bouncing back to him off the valley walls, distorted into what sounds like a chorus of unseen beings. Even the groaning of glaciers or the low rumble of distant landslides could have been interpreted as the anger or approval of mountain spirits. Without the context of modern geology, it's no wonder our ancestors heard intention in these sounds. The connection between mountains and the divine runs deeper than mere misinterpretation, though. For many cultures, peaks were literal bridges between earth and sky, the highest places where humans could get closest to their gods. The Inca carved stairways into the Andes to reach their celestial patrons, while the Maori of New Zealand revered Taranaki Maunga as a frozen ancestor, his slopes holding the memory of ancient battles. These beliefs weren't just poetic metaphors, they were survival strategies. By attributing agency to the mountains, people could rationalize avalanches, storms, and droughts as messages to be decoded rather than random tragedies. A rumbling peak wasn't just noise, it was a warning to move the village, a sign to plant crops, or a call to prayer. Yet even today, there's something undeniably magnetic about these stories. Modern hikers on Mount Fuji still report feeling watched, while climbers in the Rockies describe hearing faint, unintelligible murmurs in the thin air. Science gives us the tools to explain these phenomena: auditory pareidolia, infrasound, the way altitude affects perception, but it can't quite strip away the primal awe that makes us crane our necks upward, half expecting the mountain to answer back. That lingering sense of wonder might be the most enduring legacy of these ancient myths. They remind us that long before we mapped the Earth's crust or measured seismic waves, we were already listening, not just with our ears but with our imaginations. And in that space between sound and story, the mountains spoke. Sometimes the mountains don't just speak, they repeat. Picture a lone hiker in the Alps, calling out to check if the path ahead is clear. Seconds later, the cliffs throw her voice back at her, but twisted, the syllables stretched, the tone warped into something almost unfamiliar. For a heartbeat, it feels like someone or something is answering. That spine-tingling moment isn't magic, it's pure physics. Sound waves, ricocheting off rock faces like invisible bullets, can bend and fracture in ways that turn an ordinary echo into something uncannily human. The science behind this is both simple and surreal. When you shout into a canyon, your voice doesn't just bounce back cleanly, it fractures. Different frequencies hit the rock at slightly different angles, some absorbed, others reflected. High notes might vanish, leaving only the guttural lows behind. The delay between your call and its return can stretch words into drawn-out moans. In just the right conditions, say, a narrow gully with jagged walls, those distortions can stitch themselves into something eerily close to speech. There's a reason so many cultures have tales of giants or spirits mocking travelers from the cliffs. To ancient ears, these echoes were voices, their meaning just out of reach. Modern hikers still report these phantom conversations. In Norway's fjords, climbers describe hearing their own laughter echoed back as ghostly chuckles, as if unseen watchers found their jokes funnier than they did. In the American Southwest, a backpacker's casual hello can return minutes later, fragmented into what sounds like a question, who, sending shivers down even seasoned adventurers' spines. These experiences aren't hallucinations, they're acoustic illusions, the landscape acting like a funhouse mirror for sound. But imagine hearing those same distortions 2,000 years ago with no understanding of how sound travels. Wouldn't you, too, assume the mountain itself was answering? Early societies didn't just misinterpret these echoes, they wove them into their mythologies. The Greeks told of nymphs called Echo, cursed to only repeat others' words, her voice forever trapped in the rocks. In Wales, legends describe giants hurling insults across valleys, their booming taunts actually the work of wind and geography. Even the name Echo comes from the Greek echo, meaning sound, but also tied to stories of unrequited love and voices doomed to linger. These weren't just fanciful tales, they were attempts to explain a phenomenon that felt supernatural. Without the concept of sound waves, what else could our ancestors believe except that the mountains were alive? The deception goes deeper than mere repetition. Certain rock formations act like natural amplifiers, focusing echoes into startling clarity. In Peru's Moray terraces, a whisper at one end of the ancient agricultural site can be heard 100 feet away, a trick of concentric stone circles. Had an Incan priest stood there murmuring prayers, the returning voice might have seemed like divine approval. Similarly, the Hindu shrine of Vitala temple in India has pillars that sing when struck, a feat of acoustic engineering that medieval worshippers likely took as proof the gods were near. These places weren't just sacred by accident, their very geology made them feel like thresholds to another world. Yet the most haunting echoes aren't the clear ones, they're the garbled, almost human murmurs that defy explanation. In Scotland's Glencoe Valley, soldiers once swore they heard Gaelic whispers in the mist, only to find no one there. Scientists now suspect temperature inversions. Layers of warm and cold air can bend sound for miles, carrying snatches of conversation from distant farms or trails. To a Bronze Age shepherd, though, those drifting voices would have been spirits of the dead or omens of coming storms. Even today, with all our knowledge, there's something primal about hearing your own voice come back changed. It taps into a deep-seated instinct, the fear or hope that we're not alone. What makes these acoustic tricks so powerful is how they exploit our brain's hunger for patterns. Humans are hardwired to recognize voices, even in randomness, a survival trait that helped our ancestors detect predators or allies in the rustling grass. When a mountain's echo distorts a shout into a moan, our neural circuitry scrambles to make sense of it, often landing on the fantastical. That's why so many talking mountain legends involve warnings or prophecies. It's easier to believe the earth is trying to tell us something than to accept that sound, like light, can bend and lie. The next time you stand at the edge of a canyon and yell into the void, listen closely to what comes back. That broken, half-familiar voice isn't a ghost or a god, but for thousands of years, that's exactly what people thought it was. And in a way, they weren't entirely wrong. The mountains do speak. They just do it in a language of physics, not words. All it takes is a shift in perspective, or a clever trick of the air, to remind us how thin the line between nature and myth really is. Not all mountain voices come from echoes. Some rise from the very bones of the earth itself, a chorus of wind threading through hidden fissures and narrow stone channels, transforming solid rock into a giant natural flute. In Mongolia's Gobi Desert, travelers for centuries have reported hearing the singing sands dunes that emit low, haunting hums when the wind sweeps across them, a sound so melodic it's woven into local creation myths. Similarly, the Greek god Pan was said to conjure music from his pipes, but the real magic might have been the Aegean winds whistling through the region's sea caves and cliffside hollows. These aren't just random noises, they're the product of precise physics, where air forced through tight spaces vibrates at specific frequencies, creating tones that can feel eerily intentional. The science behind these Aeolian sounds, named after Aeolus, the Greek god of wind, reveals just how easily nature mimics art. When wind rushes through a crack or tunnel in a mountain, it doesn't flow smoothly. It tumbles, spins, and collides with the walls, generating vibrations that our ears interpret as whistles, moans, or even distant singing. The narrower the passage, the higher the pitch, the rougher the rock edges, the more dissonant the tone. In Utah's slot canyons, gusts can produce sustained notes like a cello's bow dragged across strings, while in the Himalayas, wind-scouring ice caves creates deep, resonant drones that monks once attributed to Yetis chanting. To ancient ears, these sounds weren't random, they were messages, warnings, or the very voices of the mountain spirits. Folklore worldwide mirrors this phenomenon with uncanny accuracy. The Navajo speak of Y-acute adjective I-I-T-S-O-H, a giant whose breath howls through Canyon de Chelly, shaping the wind's cries into words. In Iceland, sagas tell of elves Huldufólk who sing through lava tubes, their melodies actually the result of Arctic gales funneling through volcanic rock. Even Marco Polo wrote of a Central Asian mountain that sang like a human voice during storms, likely the same wind-sculpted formations that modern geologists have recorded producing frequencies between 100 and 110 Hz, a range eerily close to the male baritone. The consistency of these stories across continents hints at something profound: humanity's shared instinct to anthropomorphize the wind's music, to hear intention in its rises and falls. But perhaps the most striking examples come from places where the wind doesn't just sound human, it speaks. In Turkey's Cappadocia, certain cave systems act like colossal throat chambers, amplifying gusts into guttural vowel sounds that locals once believed were the whispers of trapped jinn. Similarly, the booming sands of California's Kelso Dunes emit low-frequency pulses that can travel for miles, audible to Native American tribes as the thunder of their ancestors' drums. These sounds aren't just passive, they interact with the landscape. A gust hitting a cliff face might split into multiple streams, each vibrating at a different pitch, creating harmonies so complex they feel composed. It's no wonder so many cultures developed rituals to answer the wind, leaving offerings, chanting back, or even carving flutes to mimic its songs. The psychological impact of these sounds can't be overstated. Studies in psychoacoustics show that irregular, ambiguous noises like wind whistles trigger our brains to search for familiar patterns, often landing on speech or music. Combine that with the isolation of high altitudes, where thin air can induce mild hypoxia, and it's easy to see how a lonely shepherd might swear he heard his name carried on the breeze. Even today, sound artists like Bernhard Leitner create installations that replicate Aeolian phenomena, proving how readily we attribute emotion to wind's abstract sounds. A rising pitch feels like a question, a fading moon seems like a lament. Yet for all our modern understanding, there's still something unsettlingly alive about these mountain whispers. In Scotland's Fingal's Cave, basalt columns pipe organ-like chords when storms roll in, a phenomenon that inspired Mendelssohn's Hebrides Overture. Visitors often describe the sensation of the cave breathing, its tones shifting as if in response to their presence. That illusion of dialogue of the earth listening before it answers is what makes these sounds so fertile for myth. They're not monologues, they're conversations waiting to happen. The next time you hear the wind sighing through a rocky pass, pause for a moment. That sound you're hearing isn't just air moving, it's the mountain reshaping breath into music, a trick of physics that fooled entire civilizations into believing the stones were alive. And in a way, they weren't wrong. The mountains do sing. We just had to learn the difference between a lullaby and a language. Beneath the thin crust of soil we walk on, the earth is never silent. Mountains, those seemingly eternal sentinels, are in constant motion, shifting, grinding, and groaning as tectonic plates collide deep below. Modern seismographs capture these sounds as low-frequency rumbles, some too deep for human ears to hear but felt as unsettling vibrations through the ground. To ancient cultures, these weren't just random tremors. They were the voices of the earth itself, angry, prophetic, or divine. Take Japan's Yama no Kami, the mountain spirit said to growl like thunder before disasters. For centuries, villagers listened for these warnings, interpreting tremors as the kami's displeasure. When Mount Fuji shuddered in 1704, the resulting eruption was seen not as geology but as a spirit's roar, a belief that shaped rituals to appease the peaks. Half a world away, the Maori of New Zealand told of Uamoko, the god of earthquakes, whose restless turning in his mother's womb caused the ground to shake. These myths weren't mere superstition, they were frameworks for understanding the unexplainable. A rumbling mountain wasn't just noise, it was a conversation with the divine. Science now reveals the truth behind these groans. When tectonic plates slip, they release energy as seismic waves, some audible as deep, booming infrasound. In Alaska's Denali, researchers have recorded quakes producing frequencies as low as 1 Hz, a sound more felt than heard, like the bass note of some colossal instrument. To the untrained ear, these vibrations could easily be mistaken for a giant's footsteps or a deity's sigh. Even more haunting are the non-volcanic tremors detected beneath ranges like the Cascades' continuous, days-long hums with no clear cause, like the earth itself is murmuring in its sleep. The line between geology and myth blurs in places like Iceland's Eyjafjallajökull, where eruptions are preceded by weeks of subterranean, song harmonic tremors caused by magma forcing its way through rock. Medieval Norse settlers, hearing these eerie harmonics, spun tales of Jötun, giants trapped beneath the mountains, their struggles shaking the land. Similarly, in the Andes, the Inca attributed quakes to Pachamama, Mother Earth, rearranging her body, a poetic truth mirroring modern plate tectonics. These cultures weren't wrong about the mountain's agency, they simply clothed the science in stories, yet some mountain voices defy even modern explanation. In India's Nilgiri hills, locals speak of urumi, a low, drum-like sound preceding landslides with no seismic trigger. Scientists speculated could be boulders grinding underground, but to the Toda people, it's the mountain's heartbeat. Likewise, the Seneca guns of North Carolina mysterious booms along the coast have been blamed on shallow quakes, yet no fault lines exist there. Such phenomena remind us that, even with advanced tools, the Earth keeps some secrets. Perhaps the most striking proof of this auditory illusion lies in human biology. Infrasound frequencies below 20 Hz can induce unease, dizziness, or even visions in some people. Experiments by the late physicist Vic Tandy revealed how exposure to 18 Hz sound waves triggered feelings of an unseen presence, a sensation eerily similar to accounts of mountain spirits. When ancient shamans spoke of hearing the gods in the tremors, they might have been describing a very real, physiological response to the Earth's vibrations. Today, we've traded myths for monitors, yet the mountains still speak. In Nepal, seismologists work with Buddhist monks to interpret quakes as earth prayers, blending science and spirituality. In California, indigenous tribes use traditional stories about why a K glottal stop Ityutyu, the trembling earth, to teach earthquake preparedness. The groans of the earth haven't changed, only our ability to translate them. And in that translation, we're left with a humbling thought. Maybe the old myths weren't so far off after all. The mountains were never silent. We just needed better ears. To the Norse, an avalanche wasn't just snow. It was the voice of a Jötun, a mountain giant roaring in fury as it shook off winter's weight. In their sagas, these rumbles were the thunderous arguments of Ymir's descendants, their clashes echoing through fjords like divine warfare. But travel to the Andes, and the same seismic growl took on a different meaning. To the Inca, peaks like Osangate weren't just stone, they were Apu, living lords whose whispers in the wind dictated planting seasons or warned of drought. What one culture heard as chaos, another decoded as prophecy, proof that mountains don't speak in words, but in the meanings we assign them. This linguistic alchemy turning noise into narrative shaped entire civilizations. Consider the Himalayas, where Tibetan monks still pass the groan of shifting glaciers as Dakini songs, celestial messages encoded in ice. Contrast that with the Maori of New Zealand, for whom the rumble of Mount Taranaki signaled the grief of a lover separated from his kin. Even the pitch of a sound could shift its meaning. The deep, resonant booms of Mount Etna's eruptions were Zeus's anger to Greeks, but Peel's creative fire to Hawaiian storytellers. The mountain's voice never changed, only the ears listening to it. Language itself became a filter for these interpretations. The Quechua word Cuhapaj means both noble and echo, binding social hierarchy to the land's acoustics. In Siberia, the Tuvan verb kume, throat singing, mimics the harmonics of wind through passes, a literal attempt to converse with peaks. These linguistic quirks weren't coincidental, they were survival tools. When your life depended on reading the mountain's moods, every creak and groan needed a name, a story, a response. A Basque shepherd hearing rock slides as Meru, giant footsteps, knew to move his flock. A Sherpa interpreting summit winds as La, deity breath, understood when to delay a climb. The most striking examples emerge where cultures collided. When Spanish conquistadors reached the Andes, they dismissed Inca mountain rituals as pagan nonsense, missing how huaca, sacred sites, often marked places where echoes or wind tunnels created voices. Similarly, European settlers in North America mocked native tribes for hearing spirits in geysers, not realizing these sounds were early warnings of thermal activity. The mountains spoke the same language of physics worldwide, but colonial arrogance deafened newcomers to dialects honed over millennia, yet some interpretations shared uncanny parallels. Both the Swiss Alps and Japan's Shinto traditions have legends of silent mountains peaks that only spoke to the virtuous. In Chile's Atacama, the Licancaba volcano's infrasound hums were considered ancestor songs, mirroring West African tales where Mount Cameroon's tremors were the voices of the dead. These similarities suggest something universal. Humans everywhere crave dialogue with the land, even if we must invent the vocabulary ourselves. Today, this legacy lingers in unexpected ways. In Bhutan, highway engineers consult monks before blasting tunnels, fearing disturbing a mountain's voice will anger protective deities. In Iceland, tour guides still point out troll caves where wind sounds like grumbling, a playful nod to old beliefs. The mountains haven't stopped speaking. We've just swapped shamans for seismologists, but perhaps there's wisdom in the old ways. When Nepal's elders say Langtang's avalanches sing mourning songs, they're not wrong. The science confirms specific frequencies in sliding snow. The poetry was physics all along. What these cultural lenses reveal isn't just creativity, it's adaptability. Faced with a sound they couldn't control, our ancestors gave it intention, morality, even personality. A rumble wasn't random, it was a lesson, a plea, or a joke. That instinct to hear story in stone might be the most human thing of all. In the frozen reaches of Siberia, a shaman crouches near a smoking fire, his head tilted toward the distant Altai peaks. To outsiders, the wind howling through the passes is just noise, but to him, it's a conversation. He claims to hear the mountain's sighs, its warnings, even its laughter. This isn't mere theatrics, it's a centuries-old tradition of deep listening, where spiritual intermediaries trained themselves to decode nature's ambiguous sounds. Across the tundra, the Tuvan people still speak of eerins, mountain spirits who reveal themselves not in words, but in the creak of ice, the rustle of dwarf birch, the subsonic hum of permafrost shifting beneath the earth. The shaman's role wasn't just to hear these sounds, but to translate them into guidance for the community. How did they do it? Modern research suggests these rituals often involved altered states of consciousness induced by fasting, rhythmic drumming, or psychoactive plants like Amanita muscaria mushrooms. In these trances, the brain's auditory cortex becomes hyperactive, amplifying subtle noises and stitching them into patterns. A distant rockslide might morph into a spirit's shout. Wind through a canyon could become a whispered prophecy. High-altitude hypoxia, thin air at elevation, adds another layer, triggering mild hallucinations that blur the line between external sound and internal vision. For the shaman, these weren't hallucinations at all, but the lifting of a veil, allowing direct communion with the mountain's voice. The tools of this trade were as practical as they were mystical. Tuvan throat singers, for example, mastered sigit, a technique mimicking the harmonics of wind through rock fissures. By echoing the mountain's own speech, they believed they could provoke a response, a call and response ritual that mirrors modern sonar. Similarly, Sami shamans in Scandinavia used brass bells to test the acoustics of sacred sites, listening for changes in reverberation that might signal a spirit's presence. These methods reveal a sophisticated understanding of soundscapes long before the invention of audio analyzers, but the shaman's true skill lay in contextualizing ambiguity. When a Yakutsk tribesman heard a strange echo in the Verkhoyansk range, the shaman didn't just identify it as wind, she interpreted its tone. A high-pitched whine might mean a storm was coming. A low groan could signal unstable ground. This wasn't superstition, it was an early form of ecological monitoring, wrapped in myth for easier transmission. The mountain's language became a living database, its words encoding everything from weather patterns to migratory routes. The legacy of this practice lingers in unexpected places. In Peru's Quero Nation, descendants of the Inca still perform hewarikai, offerings to mountain spirits at spots where echoes are clearest. In Norway, Sami reindeer herders follow, singing stones, rocks that resonate when struck, guiding them through blizzards. Even Western science acknowledges the power of these techniques. A 2019 study in Human Ecology found that Himalayan shamans could predict avalanches with 80% accuracy by interpreting subtle sound shifts, a skill now being studied by avalanche forecasters. What fascinates most isn't the shaman's claims of understanding mountains, but the universality of the impulse behind them. From the Druids of Wales to the Mapuche of Chile, cultures separated by oceans and millennia all developed rituals to listen to peaks. That consistency suggests something profound. In the absence of scientific frameworks, humans default to relationship. If the mountain speaks, it must be a person, or at least a being with intentions. And if it can speak, perhaps it can be reasoned with, appeased, or even befriended. Today, we've swapped drumming for Doppler radar, but the yearning remains. When a geologist leans over a seismic monitor, translating jagged lines into predictions, she's not so different from that Siberian shaman, both straining to hear the earth's whispers before they become roars. The tools have changed, but the essential question hasn't. What is the mountain trying to tell us? Maybe the answer lies not in choosing between myth and science, but in recognizing how one birthed the other. After all, every seismograph trace is just another kind of story, one we're still learning to read. The roar of thunder doesn't just shake the ground, it fractures the sky, a sound so immense that ancient cultures from every corner of the earth swore it was the voice of something alive. In the Himalayas, villagers still speak of Indra, the storm god whose chariot wheels crack the clouds. Norse skalds wove tales of Thor hammering the heavens, each strike a wordless battle cry. But listen closer to the way thunder rolls through a mountain pass after the initial boom. The sound splinters ricocheting off cliff faces, stretching into drawn-out growls or eerie, staccato laughter. In the right valley, a single lightning strike can become a chorus of voices, some deep and guttural, others sharp as a shout. It's no wonder so many myths describe thunder not as noise, but as argument celestial beings bickering just beyond the veil of the sky. This auditory illusion isn't limited to peaks. In the plains of Africa, the Dogon people interpreted thunderclaps as the Namo, ancestral spirits, debating the fate of the living. The ancient Greeks heard Zeus's disputes with Hera in the way thunder rumbled over Mount Olympus long, low rolls for his displeasure, sharp cracks when he lost patience. Even the pitch of the sound shaped its meaning. High, hissing thunder in Mesoamerican lore signaled the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl speaking, while bass-heavy booms in Finland were the Ukko god heaving boulders across the sky. What unified these interpretations wasn't just imagination, but a quirk of geography. Mountains act like natural amplifiers, bending and warping thunderclaps until they resemble speech. A storm in the Swiss Alps might send echoes caroming between peaks for minutes, layering claps into what sounds like overlapping voices, a phenomenon the Romans called Jovis Tonitua, Jupiter's many tongues. Yet the anthropomorphism of thunder runs deeper than acoustics. Humans are wired to detect agency in ambiguity, a survival trait that helped our ancestors spot predators in rustling grass or interpret a rival tribe's distant drumbeats. Psychologists call this hyperactive agency detection, and it explains why isolated cultures worldwide independently heard thunder as speech. When the brain encounters a pattern it can't immediately explain, like the irregular rhythms of a storm, it defaults to assuming intention. That's why Navajo elders described thunder as Tonanili's footsteps, while in Japan farmers heard Rajin's drums. The sound was identical, the stories were the brain's attempt to make sense of chaos. The most haunting examples emerge where thunder interacts with unique geology. In Venezuela's Catatumbo Delta, a perpetual storm generates up to 280 lightning strikes per hour, a cacophony so relentless locals named it the River of Fire in the Sky. Scientists attribute it to methane-rich air colliding with Andean winds, but to the wary people, it was the souls of fallen warriors clashing eternally. Similarly, Norway's Trollfjord traps thunder in its narrow walls, stretching booms into moans that medieval sailors swore were giants mourning lost treasure. These places didn't just inspire myths, they performed them, turning weather into theater. Modern technology hasn't dulled this instinct. Storm chasers still anthropomorphize thunder, describing a particularly violent supercell's roar as screaming or a distant roll as muttering. Even meteorologists admit to assigning mood to storms, a vestige of that ancient neural wiring. The difference now is understanding the mechanics, how temperature inversions conduct sound for miles, how valley shapes act like echo chambers, how positive lightning strikes produce sharper cracks than negative ones. But strip away the science and the primal response remains. When thunder shakes your windows at 3 a.m., part of you still wonders, just for a heartbeat, if something out there is trying to say your name. That lingering chill is the true power of these myths. They remind us that long before Doppler radar, humans were still brilliant storm predictors, reading thunder's timbre for coming hail, its delay for distance, its reverberations for valley depth. The stories weren't just fanciful, they were frameworks for survival, wrapped in the irresistible allure of a sky that seemed to talk back. So the next time you hear thunder roll across the ridges, listen past the boom. Somewhere in those fading echoes, you might catch the faintest whisper of all our ancestors ever believed. There's a peculiar kind of silence atop a mountain, not an absence of sound, but a thinning of it, where the usual hum of life falls away, leaving only the occasional whisper of wind or the distant crack of shifting ice. In these high, lonely places, the mind plays tricks. Climbers on Everest have reported hearing faint, disembodied voices calling their names in the death zone, where oxygen starvation blurs the line between reality and hallucination. Solo hikers in the Rockies swear they've caught snippets of conversation on empty trails, only to turn and find no one there. These aren't ghost stories, they're the brain's desperate attempt to fill the void where human noise should be. And if modern adventurers armed with GPS and weather apps still succumb to these auditory illusions, imagine how ancient travelers, alone in the clouds with nothing but their own breath for company, might have interpreted every creak and sigh of the mountain. Isolation does more than distort sound, it rewires perception. At high altitudes, hypoxia subtly alters cognition, slowing reaction times and heightening suggestibility. Tibetan herders have long known this, speaking of la lung, mountain wind madness, a state where the thin air stirs visions or phantom sounds. Science backs this. Studies on alpine climbers show that prolonged exposure to low oxygen can trigger mild auditory hallucinations like distant bells or muffled speech. Combine that with the sheer sensory deprivation of a barren slope, and it's no wonder so many cultures peopled their peaks with spirits. The Sherpas Yeti, the Alpine Salvinal, even the Greek Oreads, these weren't just fanciful monsters. They were explanations for the uncanny sensation of being watched, followed, or spoken to in places where no human could possibly be. Yet the mountain's silence is rarely absolute. Strange acoustics flourish in thin air. In the Andes, the Puna grasslands act like natural amplifiers, carrying a shout miles farther than at sea level. A lone llama's cry might ricochet between valleys, warping into something eerily human. Similarly, the Inuit speak of Kalupalak pale figures who mimic children's voices to lure the unwary, a myth possibly rooted in the way Arctic winds distort sound across ice fields. When every echo feels deliberate, it's easy to believe the land itself is conspiring. The psychological toll of isolation sharpens these illusions. Norwegian polar explorer Fridtjof Nansen wrote of hearing phantom sledges during his Arctic treks, the crunch of his own boots morphing into imagined pursuers. Modern researchers call this the third man effect, a phenomenon where extreme solitude conjures an invisible presence. For ancient peoples, this unseen companion wasn't a trick of the mind, but a mountain spirit. The Cherokees Nihi, benevolent but mischievous beings who whispered directions to lost hunters. The line between survival mechanism and supernatural belief blurs when you're days from the nearest village and the rocks seem to murmur your name. What makes these stories so enduring isn't just the mystery, it's the utility. Myths born in isolation served as early warning systems. The Ainu of Japan avoided certain volcanic fissures where steam vents produced low, moaning sounds, calling them kami gods weeping. Geologists now know those areas were prone to toxic gas leaks. Likewise, Quechua elders taught that Apu Mountains growled before landslides, a folkloric shorthand for the infrasound rumbles that precede collapsing slopes. The genius of these tales lay in their duality. They explained the unexplainable while encoding life-saving knowledge. Today, even with satellite phones and Gore-Tex, the mountain's eerie allure persists. Search and rescue teams in the Himalayas still swap stories of climbers who followed voices off-trail, only to vanish into crevices. Backpackers in the Sierra Nevada recount nights when the Milky Way seemed to pulse in time with distant, drumming echoes later attributed to rockfalls miles away. The peaks haven't changed, only our metaphors have. Where ancestors heard gods, we hear geology, but the deeper truth remains: isolation doesn't just breed legends. It strips away the noise of civilization, leaving us alone with the oldest question of all. Are we really the only ones listening? Deep beneath the Mediterranean island of Malta lies a labyrinth older than the pyramids, a 3,000-year-old temple called the Hal Saflieni Hypogeum, where sound behaves in ways that defy logic. Whisper a word in its oval chamber known as the Oracle Room, and your voice amplifies, reverberating through the stone with an eerie, almost supernatural clarity. Archaeologists have measured frequencies in this space that resonate at 110 Hz, a pitch known to alter brain activity, inducing trance-like states. This isn't accidental architecture, it's proof that ancient cultures didn't just hear the world's acoustics, they designed them. And if humans could engineer caves to sing, what might natural landscapes, like mountains, have done without any help at all. This is the realm of archaeoacoustics, a field bridging archaeology and physics to study how pre-industrial societies interacted with sound. Researchers like Stephen Waller have mapped Neolithic caves where paintings cluster in spots with the strongest echoes, suggesting art was placed where the walls spoke back. In Peru's Chavin de Huanta, tunnels funnel wind into a roar mimicking a jaguar's growl, a sacred sound engineered to awe worshippers. These discoveries reveal a pattern. Long before microphones or speakers, humans sought out and sometimes built spaces where the earth itself seemed to vocalize. Mountains with THEIR Chinese letter acoustics would have been the ultimate unbuilt temples. Consider the echoing canyons of Utah's Bryce Canyon, where Paiute legends describe the hoodoos as evil legend people turned to stone, their voices forever trapped in the wind. Modern tests show these spires act like a forest of stone flutes, producing dissonant harmonics when gusts hit just right. Similarly, Scotland's Fingal's Cave, with its basalt columns, generates a haunting, organ-like drone during storms, a phenomenon Mendelssohn immortalized in music after visiting in 1829. These places don't just have echoes, they perform, their geology conducting sound into something eerily intentional. The science behind this is both simple and profound. Hard, smooth surfaces like cliff faces reflect sound cleanly, while jagged rocks fracture it into fragments. A narrow valley acts like a waveguide, channeling whispers for miles, while a concave bowl of stone might focus random noise into a single, startling point. Ancient peoples, attuned to these subtleties, likely sought out peaks and caves where acoustics enhanced ritual places where a chant might ripple through the air like a chorus of unseen voices. In Turkey's Cappadocia, early Christians built entire churches inside fairy chimney rock formations, choosing chambers where whispered prayers amplified into celestial resonance. What makes archaeoacoustics so compelling is how it validates oral traditions. The Maori story of Rokawa, a chief whose voice still echoes in New Zealand's Raglan Caves, aligns perfectly with the way sea winds their sculpt sound into vowel-like tones. The Greek myth of Echo, a nymph cursed to repeat others' words, mirrors the physics of reflection in their limestone grottos. Even the Bible's account of Yahweh speaking to Elijah through a still, small voice on Mount Horeb takes on new meaning when you consider how desert mountains can funnel distant sounds with uncanny clarity. These weren't just metaphors, they were attempts to describe real auditory phenomena with the language of the sacred. Modern tools are now letting us eavesdrop on the past. Teams like the Acoustic Archaeology Project use laser scanners and 3D modeling to recreate how ancient sites sounded to their original visitors. At England's Stonehenge, simulations reveal the bluestones once amplified low-frequency drumming, creating a pulsing, almost heartbeat-like effect. Similar studies in the Andes suggest Inca engineers shaped Machu Picchu's terraces to bounce certain frequencies toward ceremonial spaces. If humans could manipulate stone to this degree, imagine what raw, unaltered landscapes with their wind-carved tubes and quake-fractured chambers might have achieved purely by chance. Yet the most tantalizing question remains: did early cultures learn from mountains? Did shamans observe how wind sung through certain passes and replicate those shapes in ritual architecture? The Hopi's subterranean kivas, with their echoing deflector walls, bear a striking resemblance to slot canyon acoustics. Tibetan singing bowls produce harmonics eerily similar to the drones of Himalayan ice caves. The line between imitation and inspiration blurs when nature itself is the first musician. What archaeoacoustics ultimately reveals is that the ancients weren't deluded when they heard voices in the wild, they were observant. A mountain's speech might have been the product of physics, but recognizing its patterns required a sophistication we're only now rediscovering. The stones do sing. We're just beginning to understand the lyrics. In the shadow of the Alps, an old shepherd's warning still lingers in the crisp mountain air. Ignore the voices in the rocks, and the peaks will swallow you whole. This wasn't just superstition, it was a survival manual wrapped in folklore. Across Europe, generations passed down tales like that of Der Riesenruf, the Giant's Call, where climbers who mocked eerie whispers from the cliffs would vanish hours later, buried under sudden avalanches. These stories weren't mere campfire entertainment, they were cautionary codes etched into culture long before modern hazard signs. The genius of these moral tales lay in their duality. When Swiss villagers spoke of the Berggeist mountain spirit howling before landslides, they were encoding seismic wisdom, the deep, grinding sounds that often precede collapsing slopes. In the Pyrenees, Basque legends described Mary, a goddess who hissed through cave mouths when storms approached, a poetic warning to shepherds about sudden wind shifts. Even the infamous green light phenomenon, where sunlight refracting through ice can create phantom signals, found its way into Inuit lore as Kalupalik luring hunters off safe paths. What modern science calls infrasound or pressure changes, ancestors framed as supernatural voices because terror sticks where textbooks might not. Some of the most chilling examples come from the Himalayas, where Sherpa guides still refuse to climb certain ridges after hearing Chiwa, mountain laughter, a term for the creaking of unstable seracs. Their stories tell of Migoi, yeti-like beings whose growls signal impending icefalls, a belief that mirrors modern observations of low-frequency vibrations preceding glacier calving. Similarly, in the Andes, Quechua elders teach that Apu mountains weep before mudslides, a striking metaphor for the trickling water sounds that often herald disasters. These narratives served a vital function. They made the invisible audible, translating subtle environmental cues into unforgettable drama. But the mountain's warnings weren't just about geology, they were social contracts. Take Japan's Yama-Yuba legends, where the mountain witch would wail to turn back greedy loggers from overharvesting, or the Haida Gwaii people's tales of Gojiksid, a spirit who shouted from mountaintops when fishing seasons began, ensuring sustainable catches. By personifying ecological limits as sentient peaks, these stories enforced conservation long before the concept existed. Disobedience wasn't just risky, it was sacrilegious, a taboo woven into the very fabric of community survival. The psychological power of these myths becomes clear in modern tragedies. In 2014, when 32 trekkers died on Nepal's Annapurna circuit during a blizzard, survivors reported hearing singing winds hours earlier, a detail that sent shivers through local guides. Veteran mountaineers like Reinhold Messner have confessed to heeding phantom warnings on Everest, turning back from seemingly clear paths because the mountain felt angry. Science might call this intuition or subconscious pattern recognition, but the language remains strikingly mythic. The peaks still speak. We've just traded spirits for seismic sensors. What makes these folktales endure isn't their fantasy, it's their frightening accuracy. When alpine farmers avoided north-facing slopes said to be cursed by frost giants, they were unknowingly steering clear of cold air drainage zones prone to deadly ice buildup. The Navajo Waiiakute ejective IITSOH stories, where giants' breath brought blizzards, likely originated from observations of how temperature inversions can make distant peaks appear to smoke before storms. Even the Celtic belief that certain Irish hills sang of death before landslides aligns with the 2-second infrasound pulses geologists now recognize as early warning signs. Perhaps the most poignant lesson lies in the stories where mountains didn't speak. In Tibetan Ni sacred valley traditions, some passes remain ominously silent, a sign that no divine protection exists there, and travelers must rely solely on skill. These tales acknowledge the limits of myth, carving space for human agency amid the mystery. After all, the Earth's voice is only half the conversation. The rest is learning when to listen. High above the tree line, where the air thins and silence stretches, a sudden shriek splits the sky, not a spirit, but a golden eagle, its cry ricocheting off the cliffs until it sounds almost human. To the ancient Romans, this was the voice of Jupiter's messenger. To the Kyrgyz hunters of the Tian Shan, it was the buakut, a celestial bird delivering prophecies. Yet strip away the myth, and you're left with a simple truth. Mountains are never as empty as they seem. The animals that inhabit these heights, from whistling marmots to chattering pikas, created a hidden soundscape our ancestors wove into legend, their calls distorted by wind and stone until they became something otherworldly. Take the Himalayan pika, a tiny rabbit relative whose high-pitched eep carries eerily across alpine boulder fields. To Sherpa guides, these squeaks were the gossip of meme mountain gnomes, tiny beings said to guard passes and lead travelers astray. Similarly, the Maori interpreted the rasping calls of the nocturnal moorpork owl as kaishiaki, guardian spirits warning of danger in the peaks. These weren't just creative misinterpretations, they were survival strategies. Recognizing a pika's alarm call might mean spotting a hidden snow leopard, while the abrupt silence of birds could signal an approaching storm. By attributing agency to these sounds, cultures turned practical observation into sacred lore. The illusion deepened at night. In the Carpathians, shepherds swore they heard strigoi, witches cackling on the ridges, only to discover at dawn that the noise came from lynxes, whose mating screams uncannily mimic human laughter. The Andes have their own phantom, the vizcacha, a chinchilla-like rodent whose territorial shrieks echo through canyons like a child's wail, birthing tales of lost souls trapped in the rocks. Even the Arctic's singing sands, dunes that emit low hums, are now known to synchronize with the vibrations of burrowing insects, a natural duet early Inuit likely mistook for earth spirits tuning their drums. Birds were especially potent voice thieves. The alpine chose metallic ki-or, bouncing off dolomite walls became the Salvinul's mocking call in Ladin folklore, while the eerie, flute-like song of the hermit thrush inspired Cherokee stories of Jistu, a trickster whose melodies could bend time. Some species seemed tailor-made for myth-making. The Australian lyrebird, capable of mimicking chainsaws and camera shutters, would have been downright apocalyptic in antiquity. No wonder Aboriginal tales describe mountaintop mimic devils. But the most profound misattributions came from creatures never seen at all. The Drekavac of Balkan lore, a wailing beast said to haunt high passes, matches the ultrasonic pulses of bats distorted by limestone caves into mournful howls. In Iceland, the Huldufólk hidden people were blamed for knocking rocks loose at night, a phenomenon now linked to the nocturnal rambles of Arctic foxes. Even the legendary yodeling of Tibetan peaks aligns with the vocal gymnastics of the Himalayan wolf, whose multi-octave howls fragment into eerie, almost musical phrases when filtered through ice corridors. What makes these animal voices so haunting is their interactivity. Unlike echoes or wind, fauna often seem to respond, a raven croaking when a traveler stumbles, or a marmot whistling as if in warning. This illusion of dialogue blurred the line between instinct and intent, giving rise to rituals like the Nepalese kukri dance, where hunters would mimic langur monkey calls to ask the mountain's permission before climbing. In the Alps, farmers still leave out milk for Bergmandli mountain dwarves, a tradition rooted in attracting real-life ibex, whose clattering hooves on scree once signaled safe grazing areas. Today, bioacoustics reveals just how clever these old stories were. The same terrain that warps sound also creates acoustic niches, specific frequency bands where certain animals' calls travel farthest. Eagles vocalize in ranges that pierce through wind noise. Pikas use harmonics that bounce cleanly off talus slopes. Early peoples might not have understood the physics, but they recognized the patterns. When the Ainu heard cotton koru kamai, echoing bird voices near Hokkaido's sulfur vents, they were noting a very real phenomenon: birds avoiding toxic areas by altering their songs. The mountains never spoke alone. They had collaborators feathered, furry, and scaled whose voices wove through the rocks, stitching together a tapestry of myth and meaning. Listen closely on your next hike, and you might catch the truth behind the tales, not gods or ghosts, but the untamed symphony of life itself, echoing through the stones. To the Quechua people of the Andes, the word Apu rolls off the tongue with a weight far beyond geography. It means both mountain and lord, a linguistic fusion that reveals how deeply peaks are woven into the fabric of belief. This isn't just poetic metaphor, it's a window into a worldview where landforms aren't passive backdrops but active participants in human destiny. Across the globe, languages whisper this same truth. When a single word can mean hill, god, and grandfather, it's no wonder cultures heard voices in the wind. The Aymara of Bolivia speak of Malcus, a term equally applied to mountain peaks and village elders, binding the geological and the ancestral into one unbroken line. In the Himalayas, the Tibetan law refers simultaneously to deities and the snowy summits they're said to inhabit, blurring the line between place and personhood. This linguistic alchemy didn't happen by accident. For early societies, mountains weren't just landmarks, they were kin. The Maori word Maunga means both mountain and tribal ancestor, reflecting a belief that peaks literally embodied the bones of forebears. Similarly, the Navajo DOOK adjective OOSL stroke IACUTE D San Francisco Peaks translates as the mountain that never thaws, but also carries connotations of a grandmother's enduring presence. Language here acts as a cultural adhesive, fusing geology and genealogy until they're inseparable. When your word for ridge is the same as your word for protector, every landslide or avalanche becomes a personal message, every echoing canyon a conversation. The implications ripple through grammar itself. In the Caucasus, the Svan language uses animate pronouns for mountains, treating them as living entities in sentence structure, a grammatical quirk that shapes perception as much as it reflects it. The Basque Meru giant shares its root with Mendi Mountain, embedding the idea of sentient peaks into the very architecture of speech. Even English preserves traces of this thinking. The word summit comes from the Latin summus, meaning both highest point and supreme leader, a linguistic fossil of the old reverence for high places. This blending of terms created a feedback loop between belief and experience, because the Hopi called their sacred peaks Katsanom spirit messengers. Hearing wind howl through Mesa Verde's cliffs wasn't just weather, it was a Katsina speaking. The Icelandic fjall originally meant height, but after Norse settlers personified peaks as frost giants, the word absorbed connotations of lurking sentience. Language didn't just describe mountains, it taught people how to listen to them, yet some of the most revealing examples come from languages under threat. The Tuvan word kaya means both rock and fortress, reflecting nomadic traditions of hiding livestock in mountain clefts during raids. The Inuktitut Shamanic describes a bowl-shaped valley that amplifies sound, a landscape feature so vital for hunters that its name also means ear of the land. These aren't quaint idioms, they're survival manuals encoded in vocabulary, proving how intimately sound and meaning were tied to terrain. The twist. Modern science is catching up to these ancient intuitions. Geologists now speak of mountains creeping or breathing as tectonic plates shift, language that unconsciously mirrors the animism of Apu or Malku. Even the term eruption comes from the Latin erumpere, to burst forth, as if volcanoes were living things breaking free. The gap between myth and measurement narrows when we realize both are, at heart, attempts to give voice to the voiceless. What emerges is a startling pattern. The more a culture depended on mountains for survival, the richer its linguistic entanglement with them became. The Quechua have 40 words for different types of slopes. The Scottish Gaelic Bain distinguishes between peaks that watch over valleys, Bain Uramach, and those that turn away, Bain F Hodder. These terms weren't just labels, they were relationships forged over generations of listening to what the stones seemed to say. And in that listening, perhaps they heard something we've since forgotten. That language isn't just how we describe the world, but how the world describes itself through us. When European explorers first pressed into the vast mountain ranges of the Americas and beyond, they carried more than just compasses and journals. They brought a rigid certainty that their way of understanding the world was the only valid one. Indigenous stories of speaking mountains were scribbled into diaries as quaint curiosities, dismissed as primitive superstition. The Inuit warning that the ice sings before it breaks was relegated to footnotes, while the Koyukon people's precise terms for different avalanche sounds, each signaling distinct dangers, were ignored as mere folklore. This wasn't just cultural misunderstanding, it was a willful deafness to millennia of finely tuned environmental knowledge wrapped in the guise of myth. Consider the colonial records from Canada's Rockies, where settlers mocked the stony Nakota practice of leaving offerings at whispering cliffs. What outsiders dismissed as pagan ritual was actually an astute recognition of acoustic hotspots, places where the interplay of wind and rock amplified subtle shifts in glacial ice. To trained Nakota hunters, these sounds were early warnings of unstable terrain, a survival code Europeans only grasped after countless avoidable tragedies. Similarly, when Andean villagers spoke of Apu Mountains groaning in anger, Spanish chroniclers dismissed it as idolatry, missing the sophisticated seismic awareness embedded in the metaphor. The mountains were speaking, just in a language colonial arrogance refused to decipher. The consequences of this dismissal echo through history. In 1874, a British surveying team in the Himalayas ignored Sherpa guides' insistence that certain valleys were lagam, spiritually volatile. The resulting avalanche killed 15 men, a disaster locals had avoided for centuries by heeding the subtle grumbles of snowpack. Even today, modern geologists are rediscovering what indigenous cultures always knew: the earth communicates through sound. The Inuit Kalupalik stories said to describe the creaking of sea ice now inform climate research on Arctic shelf stability, while Maori narratives of Te Rio o Ngamonga, the voice of the mountains, have been linked to infrasound patterns preceding volcanic activity. What makes this epistemic violence particularly insidious is how it severed the feedback loop between people and place. The Micmac of Nova Scotia once interpreted specific bird calls echoing off Cape Breton's cliffs as messages from Cluskap, the glacier-carved mountain spirit. These weren't just stories, they were mnemonics for navigating seasonal storms. When missionaries banned the tales as heresy, they didn't just erase mythology, they disabled an entire early warning system. Similarly, the Basque practice of listening days, silent vigils to interpret mountain winds, was stamped out as witchcraft, despite its proven role in predicting weather shifts crucial for shepherding. Yet the most tragic irony lies in how colonial powers eventually co-opted this wisdom while still denying its origins. 19th century alpine guides adopted the very avalanche forecasting techniques they'd mocked in Swiss villagers' Totenruff death call legends. American railroad engineers quietly used Shoshone terms for singing rocks to identify unstable slopes during transcontinental construction, even as they displaced the tribes who coined them. This pattern dismiss appropriate, rebrand perpetuated the myth of European ingenuity while erasing indigenous intellect. The lesson here isn't just historical, it's urgent. As permafrost thaws and glaciers retreat, indigenous communities report changes in the mountains, voices, quieter ice groans, altered echo patterns, strange new resonances in once familiar passes. Scientists are finally listening, collaborating with Inuit elders to document these shifts as acoustic climate data. The mountains are speaking louder than ever. The question is whether we've humbled ourselves enough to hear them. The misty mountains in The Hobbit don't just loom, they grumble, their caverns humming with dwarven ballads and the ominous growl of Smaug's slumber. Tolkien didn't invent this trope. He channeled an ancient instinct to personify peaks, transforming geological formations into cantankerous old giants who remember when the trees were young. Fast forward to Disney's Mona, and the volcanic goddess Te Fiti isn't just a backdrop. She breathes, weeps, and roars, her slopes contorting with emotion like flesh rather than rock. These modern myths aren't just recycling old ideas. They're proof that even in an age of CGI and satellites, we still crave mountains that talk back. Video games have turned this concept into literal gameplay. In Shadow of the Colossus, the towering colossi aren't just bosses, they're walking landscapes, their fur made of grassy cliffs, their groans the sound of shifting tectonic plates. The 2018 game Celeste goes further, personifying the mountain itself as a spectral antagonist who whispers doubts to the climber, blending psychological struggle with the age-old trope of peaks as sentient judges. Even Fortnite's recent Living Mountains event, where a peak cracked open to reveal a pulsating core, taps into that primal awe, proving you don't need ancient lore to make audiences feel small under a watching summit. Hollywood blockbusters amplify this with sound design. The Lord of the Rings films gave characters a voice through howling winds and ominous bass drones, a sonic choice that mirrors Sherpa descriptions of peaks singing before storms. Black Panther's Mount Bashenga, vibranium-rich and cloaked in holograms, speaks through ancestral visions, fusing tech with the traditional African trope of mountains as conduits to the divine. These adaptations sanitize the old myths, swapping spirits for sci-fi, but the core remains: mountains aren't scenery, they're characters. Anime and manga take it further. Naruto's Chibaku Tensei technique summons a floating mountain that screams as it crushes enemies, while Princess Mononoke's forest spirit morphs from a deer by day to a towering, vocal mountain god by night, a direct nod to Shinto kami beliefs. Even Western cartoons like Steven Universe feature sentient peaks like the Cluster, whose seismic groans are literal cries of pain. The medium doesn't matter, the metaphor sticks. Why does this trope endure? Because modern life hasn't erased our primal awe. When Game of Thrones made the Wall a frozen, almost breathing entity, it tapped into the same fear that inspired Inuit tales of glacial voices. Frozen Roman II Enchanted Forest, where rocks sing memories, mirrors Sami legends of Seidi stones that hold ancestral whispers. These stories work because they're half-truths. We know mountains don't speak, but stand alone on a ridge at dusk and tell me you've never felt the uncanny sense that the land is listening. The real magic lies in the evolution. Ancient myths framed peaks as gods to be appeased. Pop culture makes them allies, antagonists, or therapists. The How to Train Your Dragon films turn Burke's mountains into protective, dragon-shaped guardians, while Interstellar's wave planet sequence, technically not a mountain, but functioning like one reimagines geology as a ticking time bomb. The language has changed, but the conversation hasn't. Whether through a bard's tale or a VR headset, we're still leaning in, waiting for the rocks to reply. Standing alone on a wind-swept ridge, your brain does something extraordinary. It takes the chaotic rush of air over stone and convinces you, just for a heartbeat, that you've heard your name. This isn't supernatural, it's auditory pareidolia, the mind's relentless habit of stitching random noise into familiar sounds, especially human speech. Like seeing faces in clouds or the Virgin Mary on a piece of toast, our neural wiring prioritizes pattern recognition over accuracy, a quirk that once turned every gust and landslide into a potential conversation with the divine. The science behind this is both elegant and unsettling. Human brains devote disproportionate processing power to auditory cortex regions specialized for voice detection, an evolutionary holdover from when distinguishing a predator's rustle from a friend's call meant life or death. Studies using fMRI scans show that when ambiguous sounds hit our ears, the superior temporal sulcus, the brain's voice recognition center, lights up even for non-vocal noises, frantically trying to force coherence onto chaos. In quiet environments like alpine zones, where wind and water dominate the soundscape, this system goes into overdrive. A 2016 study in Nature found that subjects isolated in soundproof rooms began hearing phantom speech within minutes, proving how desperately our minds crave auditory meaning, even where none exists. Now transport this neural quirk back to antiquity. For early humans whose nights weren't filled with traffic hum or refrigerator drones, but with the eerie creaks of untamed wilderness, every unexplained sound became a Rorschach test for the ears. The Inuit legend of Kalupalik, a creature whose humming lured children, likely sprang from the ultrasonic vibrations of shifting sea ice, frequencies just beyond conscious hearing but ripe for pareidolia's embellishment. Similarly, the Welsh Jarachwai ribbon, a banshee whose wails preceded storms, mirrors the Doppler effect of wind squeezing through limestone fissures, warping into vowel-like tones. These weren't flights of fancy, they were the brain's best guess at stimuli far outside its reference library. What makes auditory pareidolia so potent in mountains isn't just the isolation, it's the acoustics. Hard, angular rock faces behave like natural sound diffusers, fracturing noise into fragments that tease the ear. A climber's own gasp for breath might rebound as a sighing chorus. A distant marmot's chirp could refract into something like whispered words. The shepherd's warning phenomenon, documented in the Alps since medieval times, describes how shouts distorted by temperature inversions seem to morph into spectral advice: turn back. A glitch in audio processing that once passed for prophecy. Modern experiments reveal how easily we're fooled. In a 2020 University of California study, participants exposed to white noise mixed with subliminal vowel sounds consistently heard meaningful phrases, often in their native tongue. When researchers added visual cues like a shadowy figure in peripheral vision, the effect tripled. Now imagine our ancestors, steeped in animist belief, watching mist curl around a peak while the wind spoke. No wonder Tibetan monks still debate whether the dry female yak calls they hear at dawn are animals or mountain spirits. The line between biology and belief blurs when your own neurons are the myth-makers. Yet this neural trickery served a purpose. Hearing voices in the storm might have saved lives. The brain's false positives mistaking a rustle for a growl err on the side of caution, a survival bias baked into our DNA. When Andean shepherds attributed the "ia" of gusty passes to Achakilla spirits, they were more likely to heed sudden weather shifts. The Sherpa taboo against loud noises in sacred valleys, born from tales of peaks awakening, inadvertently prevented avalanche triggers. Pareidolia in this light wasn't a bug but a feature, an early warning system wrapped in folklore. Today we understand the mechanism, but the magic lingers. Even knowing the science, who hasn't felt a chill when the wind seems to whisper? That shiver down your spine isn't ignorance, it's the ghost of an ancient instinct, reminding you that for all our technology, we're still wired to listen for voices in the void. The mountains never needed tongues, we gave them ours. In the high valleys of Bhutan, there's a mountain so silent that locals say even the wind holds its breath when passing. Unlike the thunderous peaks of Greek myth or the whispering cliffs of Navajo tradition, this summit offers no echoes, no groans, only a stillness so profound it feels deliberate. For the monks who meditate in its shadow, this silence isn't an absence. It's a language unto itself, a sacred void where the mountain speaks not in sound, but in the weight of its quiet. This reverence for silent peaks reveals a paradox. Sometimes what a mountain doesn't say carries more power than its loudest roar. Tibetan Buddhists practice Ninthun, retreats where they sit motionless for hours, attuning themselves to the soundless voice of sacred summits like Mount Kailash. To them, the absence of earthly noise isn't emptiness, it's the presence of something older than words, a primordial stillness that mirrors the mind in deep meditation. The same mountain that Hindu pilgrims circle for its cosmic hum is to these monks a mute guru teaching through quietude. The contrast between cultures that hear divine chatter and those that worship silence couldn't be starker. In Japan, Shinto traditions hold that kami spirits in peaks like Mount Fuji communicate through subtle signs, a rustle of leaves, a shift in mist, rather than speech. Meanwhile, the Inuit of Nunavut describe certain Arctic mountains as Tuniat, places so silent they're thought to absorb sound, swallowing prayers and secrets alike. These beliefs aren't contradictions, they're different dialects in humanity's conversation with the earth. Science offers a lens to understand this duality. Infrasound studies reveal that some mountains genuinely are quieter, their geology absorbing vibrations rather than reflecting them. The limestone karsts of China's Guilin region, for example, dampen echoes so thoroughly that hikers report an almost oppressive hush, as if the rock itself is listening. Psychoacoustics suggests that such silence triggers a different neural response than noise, activating brain regions linked to introspection and awe. When Tibetan monks speak of hearing the universe in the quiet, they might be describing a very real neurological shift, one where absence becomes its own kind of signal. Yet the most profound lesson lies in how these silent peaks shape ritual. In the Andes, Quechua priests once sought out Ushnu stone platforms atop wordless mountains to conduct ceremonies where no one spoke for days. The silence was thought to purify intentions, stripping communication down to its essence. Similarly, the Maori Tapu sacred sites often included soundless valleys where even birds seemed to fall mute, spaces reserved for confronting truths too raw for language. These traditions hint at a universal truth: silence isn't passive, it's a mirror reflecting back what we bring to it: fear, clarity, or the unspoken weight of our own thoughts. The modern world, with its cacophony of notifications and chatter, has all but forgotten this wisdom, but stand alone on a silent summit at dawn, and you might feel it, the way the absence of sound presses against your eardrums like a question. The mountains that refuse to speak aren't withholding secrets. They're inviting us to listen differently, not for answers, but for the space between them, where meaning forms without a single word. Geomythology doesn't just study legends, it listens for the Earth's fingerprints hidden within them. Take the Greek myth of Typhon, a fire-breathing giant buried beneath Mount Etna, his anguished roars causing the volcano's eruptions. To ancient Sicilians, this was divine drama. To geomythologists, it's a poetic but startlingly accurate record of seismic activity. The screams attributed to Typhon align with harmonic tremors, low-frequency vibrations preceding magma movement, while his struggles mirror the cone collapses evident in Etna's geological strata. This isn't coincidence, it's cultural seismology, where oral traditions preserve millennia of environmental observation in metaphor. The field's power lies in its duality. When the Klamath people of Oregon recount the battle between sky god Skell and underworld spirit Lau, ending with Lau's decapitated head becoming Crater Lake, they're encoding a real event, the eruption of Mount Mazama 7,700 years ago. The blood staining the sky, pyroclastic flows, the arrows Skell fired, volcanic bombs. Geomythologists like Dorothy Vitaliano call these ethnogeological accounts stories where the line between poetry and science blurs. Similarly, the Maori legend of Taranaki's exile, where the mountain fled westward, carving the Wanganui River, matches the glacial retreat patterns of New Zealand's last ice age. The Earth wrote the script, humans just supplied the dialogue. Some of the most compelling evidence comes from tsunami lore. The Pashina Bay people of Vancouver Island tell of a night when the ocean swallowed the land whole, a tale long dismissed until sediment cores revealed a massive quake in 1700. In Japan, the tsunami stone's ancient markers warning, "Do not build below this point," are now known to align with the 1,000-year inundation cycle. These narratives weren't allegories, they were survival algorithms passed down with urgent precision. Yet geomythology's real revelation is how it reframes primitive beliefs. The Aboriginal story of the three sisters, three peaks that wept until their tears flooded the valley, was once labeled mere fantasy. Then geologists found proof of a catastrophic landslide damming the Jameson River 12,000 years ago. The tears were likely the sound of water breaching the natural dam, a hydroacoustic event preserved as oral history. Likewise, the Icelandic Eldgjá eruption of 939, which poisoned skies as far as China, appears in the Vurla Spa as the sun turning black, a detail ice core samples confirm. This discipline also exposes how myths adapt to geological change. The Greek story of Atlantis sinking may stem from Santorini's eruption, but Plato's version adds Egyptian priestly records, showing how tales morph across cultures like seismic waves. Meanwhile, Native American Great Flood stories vary by region. Inland tribes describe rivers reversing, while coastal ones tell of waves higher than trees, each reflecting localized trauma from post-glacial sea level rise. What makes geomythology revolutionary is its humility. Instead of patronizing ancient peoples as gullible, it recognizes their role as first-generation scientists, observers who lacked instruments but not insight. When Andean elders say the mountain Apu or Sungate bleeds when glaciers melt, they're not spinning fairy tales, they're tracking cryospheric shifts with metaphorical precision. The challenge now isn't proving these stories contain truths, it's learning to translate them before the last keepers of these living databases vanish. After all, the Earth hasn't stopped speaking, we've just forgotten how to listen. Imagine standing on a Bronze Age trade route where the wind doesn't just whistle through the pass, it sings a specific sequence of notes like a stone flute carved by glaciers. This isn't fantasy, it's the cutting edge of soundscape archaeology, where researchers use laser scans and acoustic modeling to resurrect how ancient environments sounded. In Peru's Chavin de Huanta, a team led by Stanford's Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics recreated the temple's original acoustics, revealing how its ventilation shafts transformed rushing water into a roaring jaguar's growl, a sacred sound engineered to awe worshippers 3,000 years ago. These digital reconstructions aren't just academic exercises, they're time machines for the ears, uncovering how geography itself shaped myth. The process is as meticulous as it is magical. First, researchers 3D map a site using LiDAR laser imaging to capture every crack and contour. Then, they feed this data into acoustic software originally designed for concert halls, which simulates how sound waves would bounce off surfaces now eroded or buried. The results can be startling. A nondescript Welsh hillside, when digitally restored to its Iron Age tree cover, suddenly produces echoes that cluster into vowel-like tones, explaining local legends of talking stones. Similarly, a reconstructed Mesa Verde cliff dwelling proves its alcoves amplified whispers into audible gossip across entire plazas, turning architecture into an ancient surveillance system. Some of the most haunting discoveries come from lost sound pathways. In Turkey's Cappadocia, wind tunnel simulations show how certain caves acted like natural megaphones, projecting voices across entire valleys. This explains Byzantine accounts of invisible choirs during ceremonies, likely monks chanting from hidden chambers, their voices flung far beyond sight. Likewise, the Aboriginal didgeridoos' droning harmonics align perfectly with the resonant frequencies of Australia's sandstone plateaus, suggesting the instrument wasn't just played in the landscape, but with it, the earth itself as co-performer. But the real revelation is how these soundscapes changed. Deforestation, mining, and even climate shifts have altered acoustics irrevocably. Scotland's Ring of Brodgar, a Neolithic stone circle, once stood amid peat bogs that absorbed low frequencies, leaving only high-pitched echoes now vanished due to drainage. Researchers suspect this filtered soundscape made rituals feel closer to the gods, a sensation modern visitors can't replicate. Similarly, the Amazon's terra preta fertile dark earth zones, when acoustically modeled with their original dense vegetation, reveal how indigenous songs used reverberation to sound like cascading waterfalls, disguising village locations from enemies. The implications ripple beyond archaeology. In Malta's Hal Saflieni hypogeum, where chambers resonate at 110 Hz, a frequency linked to theta brain states, reconstructions proved chanting here could induce collective trances, not magic but physics. The same principle applies to mountains. When Norwegian scientists recreated the acoustics of a Viking-era fjord before glacial retreat, they found ice walls once focused battle horns into beams of sound that carried for miles, turning raids into psychological warfare. What emerges is a radical idea. Ancient peoples didn't just live in their environments, they listened to them, curating sound as carefully as modern architects design sightlines. The next time you hike through a canyon, try clapping your hands. Those echoes aren't random. They're the same notes someone heard 1,000 years ago, notes that might have shaped their prayers, their stories, even their gods. The past isn't silent. We've just forgotten how to hear it. When a Western hiker describes the wind in the Rockies as whispering secrets, it might sound poetic, but to the Niitsitapi Blackfoot elders, those same sounds are in our life breath, a sacred language not meant for casual translation. This tension lies at the heart of a modern dilemma. Is framing nature's noises as speech a respectful nod to indigenous wisdom, or does it strip centuries of cultural context into a sound bite anyone can claim? The debate isn't academic. It's about who gets to define the boundary between observation and appropriation. For the Quechua of Peru, the mountain's voice isn't metaphor, it's law. Their Hulka traditions treat specific echo points as oracles, where only trained priests read the distorted reflections of spoken prayers. When outsiders record these sounds for ambient meditation apps without context, it's not just insensitive, it severs the acoustic landscape from its spiritual scaffolding. Similarly, the Sami Joik songs that mimic glacial groans and reindeer hoofbeats aren't mere artistic renditions but encoded survival maps. To reduce them to nature sounds erases their function as living navigation systems. Yet not all communities reject scientific curiosity. The Tuvan shamans of Siberia collaborate with linguists to document kara, throat-singing techniques that replicate mountain harmonics, seeing the research as preservation rather than theft. In Hawaii, geologists work alongside Kupuna elders to match Peel's legendary whales with Kilauea's infrasound signatures, a fusion of hula chants and spectrograms that enriches both traditions. The key difference: these projects are led by indigenous experts, ensuring the mountain's voice isn't extracted like a mineral sample but heard on its own terms. The line blurs when profit enters the equation. A well-known yoga brand once trademarked the term "sacred echoes" for a meditation track featuring Himalayan wind recordings, despite protests from Sherpa guides who recognized the specific Lu mountain spirit call sampled. Unlike copyright, traditional knowledge protections rarely cover acoustic heritage, leaving sacred sounds vulnerable to commercial mining. Even seemingly benign acts, like tourists testing echo points at Uluru despite Anangu requests for silence, reveal how casually we assume the right to interrogate landscapes others consider sentient. Perhaps the most nuanced perspective comes from cultures that distinguish between hearing and listening. The Maori Kaishiaki guardians of Aoraki/Mount Cook welcome seismic studies but reject attempts to decode the peak's tangi lament, a sound believed to carry ancestral grief no spectrometer could capture. Similarly, Navajo elders share avalanche warnings encoded in Waiiakute adjective IITSOH stories while guarding the deeper language of desert winds as initiation knowledge. These boundaries aren't about secrecy, they're about sovereignty over how nature's utterances get contextualized. The solution may lie in what ethnoecologist Dennis Martinez calls reciprocal interpretation, approaching natural sounds as dialogues rather than data. In British Columbia, Gixson guides now train park rangers to identify bear language in tree creeks and river tones, merging traditional observation with wildlife biology. In Norway, scientists publishing on singing glaciers credit Sami narratives as peer-reviewed sources rather than footnotes. These models treat indigenous acoustic knowledge not as folklore to be validated by Western science, but as parallel epistemologies worthy of equal weight. The mountains themselves, of course, remain indifferent to our debates. Their winds still howl through Tibetan prayer flags, their rocks still groan under Patagonian ice. But whether we call those sounds geology or gospel, small talk or scripture, changes everything, because translation isn't just about words, it's about who holds the right to decide what counts as meaning. Deep beneath the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, where the Pythia once inhaled vapors and uttered prophecies that shaped empires, the earth itself may have been her co-conspirator. Modern soil analyzers reveal two intersecting fault lines beneath the sanctuary, seeping ethylene, a sweet-smelling gas known to induce euphoria and trance states in low doses. The priestess's famous mutterings, long dismissed as theater, might have been the literal voice of the mountain speaking through her, blending geology and divinity into one uncanny dialogue. This wasn't unique to Delphi. Across the ancient Mediterranean, seismic activity and sacred sites kept eerie company. In Hierapolis, Turkey, the plutonium, a cave emitting toxic carbon dioxide, was tended by priests who held their breath while sacrificing bulls, demonstrating their divine immunity to worshippers. At Sicily's Lake Nafta, bubbling methane vents fueled tales of underworld gates where Hercules wrestled spectral foes. Even Jerusalem's Temple Mount sits atop a fault linked to occasional subterranean booms, which 1st century historian Josephus described as God's thunder. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Civilizations built their holiest shrines where the earth literally whispered, shouted, or sang. The science behind these phenomena reads like a thriller. Ethylene, the same gas once used as surgical anesthetic, causes dissociative effects at concentrations as low as 10 parts per million, precisely the levels detected in Delphi's Adyton, the Pythia's chamber. Fault lines act like natural pipelines, channeling gases from deep underground where tectonic friction heats limestone, releasing hydrocarbons. Add a dash of psychology. The Pythia sat on a tripod over the fissure, her lowered position increasing gas exposure while the temple's acoustics amplified her slurred words into eerie echoes. No wonder Plutarch, who served as Delphi's priest, wrote of a fragrant breeze preceding her trances, likely the scent of ethylene mixing with petrichor from underground springs. But the real revelation isn't just that geology enabled the oracle, it's how cultures refined their rituals around it. The Pythia only prophesied on certain days, which archaeologists now suspect correlated with seismic activity. Earthquakes can temporarily increase gas emissions, meaning the will of the gods might have followed tectonic schedules. Similarly, the 3-day purification period before consultations may have allowed ethylene to accumulate to optimal levels. This wasn't primitive guesswork, it was meticulous calibration, turning geological quirks into sacred theater. The legacy of these gas-lit revelations lingers in unexpected places. In Japan, the kami spirits of Ainu religion still speak through volcanic fumaroles on Hokkaido, where sulfur dioxide hisses like spectral whispers. In Iceland, medieval sagas describe nightfall new fires where the ground answered settlers with methane-fueled flames, sites later found to sit atop magma chambers. Even Christianity's Pentecost, where apostles spoke in tongues amid a sound like rushing wind, parallels accounts of seismic vent sites in Cappadocia, where trapped air escaping faults produces roaring gusts. What makes Delphi's case so pivotal is how it bridges worlds. The ethylene theory, first proposed by geologist Gel de Bouwer in the 1990s, faced fierce resistance from classicists who saw it as reducing mysticism to chemistry. Yet the opposite may be true. Recognizing that the Pythia's trances had a physical trigger doesn't diminish their power. It reveals how attuned ancient cultures were to the Earth's subtlest cues. When the Pythia warned Croesus his invasion would destroy a great empire, his own, was that just gas-induced babble? Or did the mountain, through its fractures and fumes, offer a clarity that sobriety couldn't match? The answer, like the vapors of Delphi, hovers just beyond reach, but stand in those ruins today where the faults still exhale traces of ethylene, and you'll feel it, the uncanny sense that the divide between Earth and Oracle was never as solid as we assumed. The stones didn't just speak, they breathed. Deep beneath the surface of Alaska's Denali, a network of hydrophones originally designed to track submarines picks up something unexpected. A constant, rhythmic pulsing at just 4 Hz, far too low for human ears to detect. These aren't man-made vibrations or animal calls. They're the mountain's own infrasonic heartbeat, the sound of tectonic stress building between plates. Across the globe, in the Swiss Alps, scientists have strapped similar sensors to glaciers, capturing ice groans at frequencies that mimic the lowest notes of a pipe organ. These aren't just curiosities, they're fragments of a sonic world our ancestors sensed but couldn't quantify. A realm where mountains don't just stand silent, they hum, growl, and resonate. The tools unlocking these secrets are marvels of modern engineering. Infrasound detectors, capable of registering frequencies as low as 0.001 Hertz, literally thousands of times deeper than human hearing, reveal how peaks like Japan's Mount Fuji emit steady drones before eruptions, like geologic tuning forks. Hydrophones submerged in Himalayan glacial lakes record the pops and cracks of shifting ice, sounds that Sherpa elders once described as yetis chewing rocks. Even LiDAR, the laser mapping technology, is being repurposed to listen visually. By measuring microscopic vibrations in rock faces, it translates seismic shudders into audible waveforms, turning entire cliff sides into giant speakers. What's startling isn't just what these technologies detect, it's how they confirm ancient intuitions. When Inuit hunters spoke of Sela, the breath of the world, making their skulls buzz near certain peaks, they might have been sensing infrasound now measured at those very spots. Tibetan monks claim that Mount Kailash sings during meditation align with modern recordings of wind, hitting its facets at exactly 59 Hz, a frequency known to induce theta brainwaves. The Maori Purakau legends of Uamoko's underground drumming now make eerie sense alongside seismographs showing magma chambers pulsing in sync with New Zealand's volcanic tremors. Our ancestors weren't imagining voices, they were feeling the physical impact of sounds they couldn't hear. Yet these tools do more than validate old stories, they expose new mysteries. In 2018, researchers in Chile's Atacama Desert deployed arrays of infrasound sensors and stumbled upon a phenomenon they dubbed skyquakes, unexplained, directionless booms emanating from the Andes' dry valleys, with no seismic or meteorological cause. Similar phantom pulses have been logged in Norway's Lingen Alps, where hydrophones picked up metallic pings resembling sonar, except no submarines exist for thousands of miles. These anomalies hint at acoustic layers to mountains we're only beginning to decipher, frequencies that might explain why certain passes feel alive even in perfect stillness. The most profound application, though, isn't scientific, it's cultural. In British Columbia, Gitga'at First Nations elders are collaborating with acousticians to map the sound signatures of their sacred peaks, blending hydrophone data with traditional knowledge. What scientists call glacial basal slip, the grinding noise of ice moving over bedrock, the Gitga'at recognize as Tizomzim's growl, a spirit said to guard the mountains. By merging these perspectives, they're creating hybrid archives, part spectral analysis, part oral history, that honor both the physics and the folklore. Of course, technology has its limits. No hydrophone can fully capture what a 17th century shepherd felt when the Dolomites moaned before a rock slide, or the visceral dread that made Inca priests scatter coca leaves at echoing caves. But when you stand beside a seismic monitor in Nepal and watch its needle tremble with a Himalayan burp, a sudden gas release from deep underground, it's hard not to feel the same awe that inspired generations to call these peaks gods. The mountains haven't changed their tune, we've just finally built the ears to hear it. High in the Swiss Alps, a hydrophone buried deep in the Aletsch Glacier picks up a sound scientists have never heard before. Not the usual creaks and groans of moving ice, but a hollow, almost mournful wail as meltwater carves new tunnels through ancient ice. This isn't just a geological shift, it's a vocal one. For centuries, the Alps spoke through the resonant booms of calving ice, and the wind whistled harmonics of snow bridges. Now, as temperatures rise, those voices are slipping away, replaced by the dull slosh of glacial lakes and the muffled cracks of destabilized rock. the mountains aren't just changing, they're losing their language. This acoustic erosion is global. In the Himalayas, Sherpa guides report that the chiwa, the laughter of vibrating seracs, has grown fainter as glaciers thin and fracture differently. The Inuit Kalupalik stories, once tied to the ultrasonic pings of healthy sea ice, now describe silence where frozen expanses once sang. Even the Andes' sacred Apu Mountains, whose groans were considered divine warnings, have shifted their timbre. As permafrost thaws, the low-frequency rumbles that once signaled landslides are now often drowned out by the chaotic clatter of rockslides. These changes aren't merely environmental footnotes, they're cultural ruptures. When a mountain's voice fades, so does a way of hearing the world. The science behind this sonic shift reveals a heartbreaking precision. Glaciers act like giant soundboards, their dense ice amplifying vibrations into deep, carrying tones. As they melt, the remaining ice becomes thinner and more fractured, less a resonant chamber, more a broken piano. A 2022 study in Nature Geoscience found that Alaska's Muir Glacier now produces 60% fewer infrasound pulses than in the 1980s, its voice literally weakening as it shrinks. Similarly, wind patterns altered by rising temperatures no longer funnel through rock fissures the same way, turning once predictable echoes into dissonant murmurs. The mountains aren't just growing quieter, they're becoming unintelligible. For indigenous communities, this loss is visceral. The Sami Joik songs, which mimic the harmonics of frozen tundra, now struggle to find their reference points as the landscapes they echo change beyond recognition. In Bolivia, Quechua priests note that the Achaquilas mountain spirits no longer speak clearly. During rituals, a sentiment that aligns with acoustic surveys showing diminished reverberation in sacred valleys due to deforestation and erosion. These aren't metaphorical grievances, they're the equivalent of losing a mother tongue. When the Yupik elder Paul John described the silence of the snows to anthropologists, he wasn't waxing poetic. He was documenting the end of an auditory relationship with the land that guided hunting, navigation, and ceremony for generations. Yet amid the loss, new voices emerge. In Norway's melting permafrost, geophones capture a phenomenon dubbed frost quakes, sharp, gunshot-like cracks as ice lenses shatter underground, a sound unheard before the 21st century. The Himalayas' newly exposed rock faces, stripped of insulating ice, now ping with metallic echoes as they expand and contract in the sun, a chorus of strange, unfamiliar tones. Some researchers speculate that these novel sounds might one day form the basis of new folklore, as future cultures weave meaning from the acoustics of a warmer world. But for now, they're dissonant and alien, like a half-learned language. The most poignant irony, the very tools recording these changes, hydrophones, seismographs, drones, are also stealing the mystery that once made mountains seem alive. A Sherpa doesn't need a spectrogram to know the glacier's mood. The sound of its cracks once told him everything. As technology translates the ineffable into data points, we risk reducing the mountain's voice to waveforms on a screen, stripping away the awe that birthed the myths in the first place. The challenge isn't just preserving these vanishing soundscapes, it's remembering how to listen to them as something more than noise. Perhaps that's why the quietest losses hurt the most. The Basque Meru legends, tied to the whistling of wind through a specific Pyrenean pass, are fading not just because the wind patterns have changed, but because the younger generation, raised on headphones and traffic hum, no longer recognizes the difference between a breeze and a breath. The mountains may still speak, but fewer and fewer know how to hear them, and in that silence something essential slips away, not just the voice of the earth, but our ability to believe it ever spoke at all. On a solo pre-dawn climb in the Patagonian Andes, A seasoned mountaineer swears he heard a chorus of children singing, not a faint, distant echo, but a clear harmonic hum resonating from the granite walls around him. The air was dead still, his GPS showed no settlements for miles, and yet the sound seemed to surround him, rising and falling like a lullaby. He later described it as not quite human, but not artificial either, a phenomenon so unsettling he abandoned his ascent despite perfect weather. His story isn't unique. High-altitude journals are filled with similar accounts. A Czech trekker in the Caucasus who heard her late father's voice warning her of an unseen crevasse. A Japanese team on Denali who recorded what sounded like Gregorian chants in their tent during a whiteout. These aren't ghost stories, they're case studies in how isolation, altitude, and the mountain's own acoustics conspire to rewrite reality. What makes these experiences so chilling is their specificity. A Swiss guide in the Bernese Oberland recalls descending a familiar route when he heard his own voice, not an echo, call his name from above in perfect dialect despite being alone on the face. A Navajo climber on Shiprock, a formation sacred to his people, described hearing rhythmic drumming that matched ceremonial songs he'd never been taught, only to find the sound ceased the moment he reached the summit. Even skeptics concede there's a pattern. The sounds often mirror the listener's cultural or emotional framework, as if the mountain is holding up a sonic mirror. A Tibetan Sherpa might hear monastic horns, an Italian alpinist opera fragments. The mind reaches for what it knows, stitching randomness into meaning. Science offers explanations, but they only deepen the mystery. Hypoxia, oxygen deprivation at altitude, can trigger auditory hallucinations by disrupting the brain's temporal lobe, which processes sound. A 2019 study in Wilderness and Environmental Medicine found that above 4,000 meters, 1 in 3 climbers experiences some form of acoustic pareidolia, where wind or blood flow in the ears is misread as speech. Add in the third man factor, a documented phenomenon where extreme stress conjures an imaginary companion famously reported by Everest's Beck Weathers, and it's easy to see how a creaking glacier could become a whispered warning. Yet these rationalizations don't account for the uncanny consistency of details across cultures, the recurring motif of choirs, names being called, or laughter where no living thing could be. The most haunting accounts come from those who have had their hallucinations corroborated. In 2016, 2 Australian climbers on New Zealand's Mount Tasman independently described hearing a woman scream for help at the same coordinates, sparking a fruitless rescue mission. Later, seismographs revealed a deep icequake had occurred beneath their route at that exact time, a subsonic vibration their brains might have up-converted into human-like frequencies. Similarly, a 2020 acoustic survey in the Rockies found that certain limestone formations act like natural Helmholtz resonators, amplifying specific frequencies into eerily vocal-like tones when wind hits at precise angles. The climbers weren't imagining things, they were hearing the mountain's hidden instruments play. Perhaps the most poignant truth lies in how these experiences change those who have them. A retired ranger from Colorado's search and rescue team recounts a lost hiker who followed angelic singing to a cave that sheltered him from a blizzard, only to discover the sound vanished when rescuers arrived. Was it luck, divine intervention, or his brain's last-ditch survival tactic? The answer matters less than the outcome. He survived. For all our technology, there's still something in the wild places that speaks to the oldest parts of us, not in words but in wavelengths we're only beginning to measure. The mountains haven't stopped telling stories. We've just forgotten how to trust them. Mountains don't speak in words, but they've never been silent. Every groan of shifting rock, every whistle of wind through a crevice, every distant avalanche's roar is part of an ancient dialogue between the earth and those who walk its slopes. What's fascinating isn't just the sounds themselves, it's how humanity has strained to translate them, bending physics into folklore, geology into gospel. From the oracle at Delphi inhaling tectonic gases to the Sherpa deciphering ice tremors as Yeti growls, we've wrapped the unexplainable in stories, not out of ignorance, but because the alternative, a world where the land is indifferent, felt too lonely to bear. These myths aren't mistakes, they're mirrors. When the Greeks heard Zeus in thunder or the Inca decoded landslides as divine warnings, they were revealing something fundamental about us. Humans are meaning makers. We're wired to find patterns, to stitch chaos into narrative, to anthropomorphize the wind because the thought of a universe that doesn't notice us is existentially unbearable. The mountain's voice was never in the stone, it was in the space between the sound and the listener, a collaboration of vibration and imagination. Yet there's startling wisdom in these misinterpretations. The Quechua-Apu legends, which linked glacial shifts to a mountain's mood, weren't just poetry, they were early warning systems, encoding seismic intuition in metaphor. The Navajo taboo against shouting in canyons, born from tales of rock spirits, prevented deadly echo-triggered avalanches long before modern geology explained why. These stories worked because they were born from generations of deep listening, of noticing how a peak's acoustics changed before a storm, or how certain passes amplified animal calls into phantom conversations. The myths weren't science, but they were observation distilled through wonder. Today, we've traded spirits for spectrograms, yet the mystery lingers. Stand alone on a ridge at dusk and tell me you've never felt the prickling sense that the landscape is aware of you. That's the real magic, not that mountains speak, but that we can't help believing they might. Our ancestors weren't wrong to hear intention in the wind. They were simply human, craving connection in a vast, uncaring universe. The peaks never needed voices. We gave them ours because silence was too heavy to carry. So the next time you're on a trail and the cliffs seem to sigh, or the rocks murmur underfoot, don't dismiss it as an illusion. Pause, listen, not for words, but for the layers beneath them. The tectonic lullabies, the cultural echoes, the way your own mind dances on the edge of pattern recognition. The mountains are talking, not in any language we know, but in the oldest tongue of all, the sound of the earth itself, restless and alive, waiting for us to lean in just a little closer. Have you ever stood on a ridge at sunset, listening to the wind hum through the rocks and sworn you heard something? Not quite a voice, but not just noise either. Maybe it was a whisper in the pines that sounded like your name, or a distant rumble that felt like the earth itself clearing its throat. If so, you're part of a tradition as old as humanity. From the shepherds of the Andes to the climbers of the Himalayas, people have been catching these half-heard conversations with the land for millennia. And now, we want to hear yours. Drop your stories in the comments below, whether it's an eerie echo that raised the hairs on your neck, a local legend about a talking peak, or even a scientific explanation for something you couldn't quite place. Let's turn this into a living archive of the world's most haunting, beautiful, and downright unexplainable mountain voices. If this journey through sound and myth left you hungry for more, there's plenty to explore beyond this video. For a deep dive into how cultures worldwide interpret natural phenomena, check out The Secret World of Weather by Tristan Gooley, or lose yourself in the stunning visuals of the documentary Mountain. Its sweeping cinematography and haunting score capture the eerie allure of high places better than words ever could. And if you're craving more blurry lines between science and legend, hit that subscribe button. We've got more adventures where this came from the songs of ancient caves to the secrets buried in desert winds. The mountains have been speaking for eons. We've just scratched the surface of what they might be saying. So keep listening, because the next echo you hear might not be an echo at all. It could be the start of a whole new